Hello, I'm Hans Süß, Associate Director for Research and Collections. Welcome to the National Museum of Natural History and to our new evolution trail. Evolution, the change of life through time, is the underlying theme of many of our exhibits about the history of life on Earth.
Natural selection happens whenever you have one version of a trait that allows individuals that bear that trait to survive and reproduce better than others. So those individuals that have the beneficial version of the trait will produce more offspring, they'll produce more babies. And in the next generation, more individuals will have that beneficial trait. And from each generation to the next, the beneficial trait will become more and more common over time. We have a lot of examples in which two kinds of species, an insect on one hand and a plant on the other, influence natural selection on the other. So for example, if we have an insect that prefers to pollinate red flowers, those flowers need to be pollinated to reproduce. So if it prefers the red flowers, it'll preferentially pollinate those red flowers at the expense of other colors. And over time, you'll get more and more red flowers in the plant population.
Adaptations are, in a sense, the most visible evidence of evolution. In a sense, they're the end products of the process of natural selection, and they're the distinctive qualities that we associate with animals and plants when we look at them. For example, here in the Hall of Mammals in the Natural History Museum, you can look in the desert exhibit at the desert fox and notice the animal has very large ears, which in that environment is an adaptation for dissipating heat. The giraffe, of course, in the savanna environment has a very long neck, which is an adaptation for browsing at the tops of trees. And the pink fairy armadillo has very large claws, which are an adaptation to burrowing, digging into the ground for protection. Sometimes natural selection leads to particularly significant adaptations. They represent major evolutionary changes or breakthroughs, and we call these innovations. Innovations allow organisms to access new environments or new resources, and so they can be particularly important moments in evolutionary history. One good example is the amniote egg, which has special membranes on the inside and a shell on the outside that keep the egg from drying out. This allowed animals to evolve onto land for the first time because the eggs no longer had to be laid in water. And so all of the animals that we see that live on land today are the result of this important innovation, the amniote egg. The process by which a single species can become many, many descendant species is called diversification. And you may notice that out in the world, there are some groups that have very few species and some that have very many. Rodents, for example, there are many hundreds of species of rodents. Bats, many hundreds of species of bats. There's just one aardvark. The diversification of rodents and bats occurs because there's a particularly important adaptation in each group that allows them to access a new resource or do something they couldn't do before. For bats, they can fly. For rodents, they can gnaw. And that allows the original species to evolve into many, many different descendant species.
Generally, species are well adapted to the environments in which they live. So when the environment changes, generally one of three things will happen. First, the species can go extinct. Second, the species can evolve through natural selection to basically become better adapted to the changing environmental conditions. Or third, the species can move. That is, it can migrate to an area that has more favorable conditions. Here in the Ice Age Hall, we have examples of all three of these outcomes. Examples of saber-toothed predators that are now extinct. You can see cold weather adaptations in the woolly mammoth. And finally, there are a number of examples of species that have changed their range in response to some kind of environmental change. For example, humans that came from Asia to North America with the formation of a land bridge between those two continents. If you take a long enough view, extinction is basically a fact of life. Of all the species that ever existed on planet Earth, almost all of them, well over 99%, are now extinct. One species loss, however, can be the gain for another species. And one example of this is when, about 65 million years ago, an asteroid impacted into the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. This impact eventually triggered the extinction of the dinosaurs. And the dinosaurs, which so dominated the Earth's landscape before that, in their absence, mammals diversified into a whole number of ecological roles they weren't in previously.